sides to this. There's the mandate to govern and then a government mandate. So a mandate to govern is quite simply just this general idea that because you have won a majority in the House of Representatives, the people have given you their blessing to run the country. And by that we mean little more than just you get to be the ministers, you get to be in charge of the departments, and you will get the Parliament will give you the funding necessary to run the basics of your government. In other words, that they'll pass supply each and every year. Then we have this other angle to government mandate, which is, as you can see here on the slide, that the winning party or coalition in an election have a mandate to enact legislation and carry out their administration based on policies that they put to the people at the election that brought it to power. Okay, so we have policies X, Y, Z. We won the election, therefore the people have endorsed our plan to do X, Y, Z. And that aspect of government mandate is a little more problematic in the sense that it's very inconsistently respected. Sometimes it is respected, sometimes it isn't. So let's get to the theory then of how it should work. All right. So the idea is Parliament does not get in the way, and by that we mean specifically the non-government elements of Parliament. So that's the minor parties, the opposition together, and the independents do not block legislation that was endorsed by the people at an election. All right. Now, there's one very clear example of this working as it should in theory. But first, I guess we'll get to the mandate to govern. All right. So we all know since 1975, there has not been a supply bill that has been blocked. We have had supply bills basically held up a little bit, awaiting amendment, an agreement from the government to amend aspects of the supply bill, but the supply bill has never been threatened since 1975. And basically the 1975 crisis, one of the results of that was both major parties essentially agreed that evermore it won't be blocked. That, yeah, you might want amendments, minor amendments here and there in a budget, but you're not going to threaten the existence of the budget altogether and create a crisis akin to 1975. Okay, so this general mandate to govern has generally been respected each and every 3-year electoral cycle. Okay, but what about the other angle? Whether your policy should be respected and whether your legislation should be respected if you put it to the people and won an election. So a really great example, of course, is the famous Work Choices Repeal. The actual name for it, as you can see there, is the Workplace Relations Amendment Forward with Fairness Bill. And here's a little quote from the Hansard by Julie Gillard, threatening the Liberal Party basically. If the Liberal Party opposes it in this House, then their actions can only be read in one way. It is a deliberate decision to deny the Australian people what they voted for. It would be a deliberate decision by the Liberal Party to act with a born-to-rule arrogance. So quite powerful words there from Gillard. And of course, the Liberal Party did roll over on work choices, even though it was their policy that they brought in. They did read the tea leaves, as you can see here. This is Erica Betts, who in the Senate second reading debate admitted Labor went to the election claiming that our legislation went too far, and we accept, that's the important word, we accept that some Australians accepted that notion that it had an impact, amongst others, on the decision by our fellow Australians. So, as we've said on a number of occasions, we will accept their verdict. That's the people's verdict, not Labor's verdict. We'll accept the people's verdict, and that is why we will not be opposing the Forward with Fairness bill. So as you can see there, it's a classic example of the opposition agreeing with the government's mandate to get rid of work choices. And as Tony Abbott more succinctly put it, work choices is dead, buried, cremated. So that might be the quote you endeavour to memorise. So that's how it should work in theory. Of course, it doesn't work that way all that often. All right. So then we need to address the idea of a balance of power mandate. And you need to be able to have a handle on this because, of course, the syllabus says competing mandates. So there's got to be two. So we have this government mandate conflicting on occasions with this balance of power mandate. So what's the theory behind this? Well, my reading of it is that the Senate has been designed in a particular way that that we don't want this House of Parliament to be controlled by the government. Okay, we don't want a friendly Senate. It's not healthy for democracy. You know, as evidenced, of course, by work choices existing in the first place, thanks to a friendly Senate that existed from 2004 to 2007. If that's true, if you accept that it's true, that the Senate's designed not to have the government controlling it, therefore, it follows that the system then intends that non-government parties have the ability to review government legislation and, if necessary, amend or block it. Okay? So, knowing this, knowing ahead of time that this is the way the Senate has been designed, the people, in effect, give these non-government parties a balance of power mandate. Okay, so now that if you agree that's true, that they have been given this mandate by the people, then what do they do with this mandate? On what occasions do they agree with the government, and on what occasions and what circumstances would lead them to blocking or amending government legislation? All right. So Don Chipp founded the Australian Democrats, and he really had an early handle on this idea that there was a political opportunity for parties to capture a voter who, whilst wants strong government in the lower house, they also want accountability in the upper house, and so they want a crossbench who, as Don Chipp so succinctly put it, keep the bastards honest. All right, and as a consequence, the Australian Democrats became that sort of default to the right of the Labor Party, to the left of the Liberal Party, centrist party that would review all policies and all legislation and hold governments to account, and on occasions block government initiatives if they feel like it is not in Australia's best interest, let's say. And so, yeah, the Democrats were very successful for a number of years. And this culminates here in the late 90s when Meg Lees, the then leader of the Democrats, did a deal with John Howard to ensure the passage of the GST legislation through the Parliament, a 10% tax on all goods and services. But the Democrats did win as part of the deal that certain things would be excluded, most particularly, as you can see there, fresh food, education, and healthcare. So the Democrats there, they respected the general mandate of John Howard, having promised a GST at the 1998 election, putting his political career on the line by promising a tax. And Meg Lees respected his overall mandate to bring in a GST, but she had a balance of power mandate, so she felt that her party was had to think about working families and lower income people, and so they won as part of those negotiations the GST-free aspects. So you can see the balance of power mandate at work there, and so they did a deal. Now, in the near term, she got a lot of positive press for having done this deal, like, you know, an adult in the room, very responsible, very sensible measure, was very good to deal with the Liberal government. But the true judge would be the Australian people, and as you can see here, the Democrats never recovered essentially from this deal, rightly or wrongly. Now, Meg Lees had good arguments for supporting the GST, and of course it's part of the furniture now, but you can see electorally they were punished. There was a perception that the Democrats had betrayed their base, that John Howard might have won the 98 election, but he didn't win it on the basis of promising a GST, that it was a deeply unpopular policy, and that she should have never done this deal with John Howard. And you can see from 98 to 2001 and 2001 to 2004, their vote collapses and they no longer have any representation in the Senate. So a cautionary tale for the minor parties that hold the balance of power. Every other minor party since is well aware of this example, and of course they're very careful if they ever agree to do any deals with the government on legislation, such as Jackie Lambie. So Jackie Lambie's been in a similar position in recent times, her vote being crucial to securing the passage of government legislation, most famously the stage 1 and 2 tax cuts and the stage 3 tax cuts, rather, basically the Scott Morrison tax plan that he took to the 2019 election. And Jackie Lambie agreed to support this tax plan, but in exchange she secured about $150 million worth of debt relief for state housing to help with the homelessness issue in Tasmania. So basically what Jackie Lambie here is doing is she is willing to respect Morrison's general mandate to bring in the tax cuts, but she's very, very careful to make sure she wins something very visible and something she can sell to the Tasmanian people as, hey, we've gotten a great deal for Tasmania, and I've been put here by Tasmanians to put Tasmania first, and I need something to show the voters that I have done this in this deal. And as a result, Jackie Lambie network seems to be here to stay. You can see here in the most recent election, Jackie Lambie herself was not up for re-election, but her vote held up. She only had a minus 0.28% swing against her party, and so Tammy Tyrrell was elected. So the Jackie Lambie network now has 2 candidates in the Senate. So her power has increased. So obviously she was successfully able to sell the use of her balance of power mandate on that issue. Okay. However, it is deals like this that have led certain people to accuse the Senate of being unrepresentative swill. So is this a balance of power mandate being used responsibly, or is this just a unethical bribe to buy a vote for Tasmania, and it's all at the expense of course, the mainland Australia, because that's for every $158 million you give to Tasmania, that's money that will not be spent perhaps in areas of greater need. I'll leave such conclusions up to you. All right. So Nick Xenophon was always good for a quote. Of course, he's no longer in federal parliament, but he was a senator similar to Jackie Lambie. He was an independent in South Australia, and his popularity grew to the point that he created a party named after himself, the Nick Xenophon team, and eventually morphed into the more vaguely termed Centre Alliance. So he quite simply says that there's 2 mandates because there's 2 votes. Australians vote for the House of Representatives and they vote for the Senate. And so, therefore, it follows that there are 2 mandates, so you get a government mandate in the lower house, and then you get a balance of power mandate in the upper house. And he was interviewed once on what he saw as his role as a key member of the crossbench, and he says sometimes the Senate has to save a government from itself, from bad legislation that will have catastrophic consequences. And he quotes the 2014 budget as a great example of this. So he, along with many others in the crossbench, refused to pass the 2014 budget until a number of things were cut. So the moral basis for doing that was Tony Abbott famously, before the 2013 election, said on SBS that there would be no cuts to education, no cuts to health, no change to pensions, no change to the GST, no cuts to the ABC or SBS, and no new taxes. And he, in his very first budget of his government, he basically broke almost all of those promises, at least in the view of many. So Nick Xenophon's view there is Tony Abbott we're actually holding him to his own promises, and we're going to ensure a 2014 budget more in line with what he promised prior to that election. So things like the GP co-payment was dropped, and university changes were dropped, and some of the cuts were dropped as well, although some of them did remain. So Nick Xenophon thinks of that as saving the government from itself. His view would be that if they hadn't softened the 2014 budget, that would have actually hurt Tony Abbott's re-election chances later on, and his popularity later on. So that's how Nick Xenophon sees the competing mandates working. Of course, the budget itself passed, but it didn't pass until some of those measures were agreed to by Tony Abbott. All right, but what about when a mandate just simply isn't respected? When the non-government parties do not support a measure by the government? So it seems to me that these non-government parties will oppose a government mandate if A, it's integral to their own identity, like the policy is so offensive to their own identity that they cannot support it even if there is a clear mandate by the people, or they want to draw some political battle lines because it's crucial to have points of difference that the voter can think about at the heading into the next election. Electoral context, what I mean by that is how well did the government win the last election? Did they win by a lot? Did they win by a little? Or did they not win at all? Are they ruling in minority? And finally, how prominent was the policy at the last election? Was it front of mind when the voters were voting, or was it one of those policies that was sort of, on page 16 of their policy document and not very many people knew about it or were talking about it, and therefore it's a harder argument to make that you have a mandate for it. So let's have a look at a few examples here. So the mining tax repeal. So famously, Abbott had these slogans. One of those slogans was to axe the tax. He's referring there to two taxes, actually, the carbon tax and the mining tax. And of course, he won with a thumping majority, getting 90 seats in the House of Representatives. So you'd think then, he has a strong mandate to axe both of these taxes. Whilst both of these taxes did eventually get repealed, the opposition decided to oppose the repeal of the mining tax. And you can just read Jenny Macklin's comments here. The reasons for Labor rejecting the bill a third time have not changed. I will go through the reasons briefly. One would have to say that the campaign against the tax has been full of contradictions. On the one hand, there are claims that the tax is a burden on Australian businesses. On the other hand, there are claims that it does not raise enough revenue. It cannot be both. Labor believes that minerals belong to the people and the benefits of the minerals in Australia should be shared. So Labor stuck to its guns, even though they lost the election, maybe partly on their insistence on the mining tax. They certainly did pretty poorly in Western Australia in that election, where mining is obviously a big issue. But they stuck to their guns and thought, no, we're going to vote against this mining tax repeal. And ultimately, it didn't matter, but it was an example of Abbott's mandate not being respected as much as perhaps it should have been. Then let's move to the same-sex plebiscite bill. So, as you can see here, this is comments from Malcolm Turnbull. We took this idea to the election and we won the election. There was no doubt about our policy. There was no doubt about our platform. This was prominently debated every day of the election campaign. Every Australian who took any interest in the election knew that this was our policy. We have a mandate for it, and the opposition should respect it. And he's right. It was a prominent issue. It was well known this was their policy. So similar to the axe the tax thing, the policy was front and center in the debate in the lead up to the 2016 election, but different. In contrast to the 2013 example, the coalition did a lot worse. They still won the election, but they won only by a single seat. They lost 14 seats at that election and suffered a 3.5% swing, negative 3.5% swing to their primary vote. So there's a bit more there, a bit more substance there for the non-governing parties to oppose the plebiscite. So This is evoked here by Bill Shorten, the then opposition leader, who said these guys are acting like they still have a 90-seat margin in the House of Reps. They don't. He acts like he's got some massive mandate. They only have a 1-seat majority. Labor has a positive platform, and we've been given a mandate by an increased amount of Australian support to stand up for our positive policies. Okay, so that's interesting. So he's claiming that even though they lost the election, because they've improved, their position had improved so much from 2013, that this improved electoral position gave him more confidence to stand up for more of his policies in opposition to the government's policies. And so they stuck to their guns and opposed the plebiscite. And they, along with enough of the crossbench, stopped the plebiscite from ever happening. And that's why we only ever got a postal survey, which is very different to a plebiscite. All right, more recently, we've got the Religious Discrimination Bill. And so this one, it was on Scott Morrison's policy agenda at the 2019 election, and they did introduce this to Parliament before the 2022 election. And you can see here, and I quote, in 2019, the government took to the Australian people a commitment to introduce new protections against religious discrimination consistent with other anti-discrimination laws. The bill honours the mandate we have from the Australian people to protect Australians from faith and religion against discrimination. Now, unlike the first two examples, okay, whilst it was definitely on their policy agenda, it was not talked about at all, really, in the election campaign. It wasn't something that was debated. It wasn't certainly wasn't front and centre of Scott Morrison's election campaign, and therefore it had nowhere near the prominence. And I very much doubt very many people were voting with this in their minds when they elected Scott Morrison as government. So again, a bit more ammunition here for the balance of power mandate to oppose. And again, this is enshrined here in this quote by Susan Templeman from the ALP. This was announced by the PM in December 2018, and when the promise wasn't honoured before the 2019 election, it became an election commitment for this current term of government. And here we are, rushing to an election and trying to tick something off the list. I think the Australian people deserve better. None of the promises to consult with us, or the states, or the territories were kept, and that's why there is a deep flaw in this bill, in that it overrides state laws. Our amendment will address that. So here the ALP aren't outright opposing it, but they're wanting some key amendments. She also makes some comments which hint at another part of the course, which is the functions of Parliament, theory and practice. So keep that in mind as well. So yes, the ALP opposed it. Much of the crossbench wanted key amendments done to it before they'd supported as well, and then it eventually got it amended so significantly that the various stakeholders convinced Morrison to drop it off the legislative agenda altogether, and so it never passed. So that's an example of a government policy that was not respected. Well, at least they didn't have a mandate to do so. Okay, so some more contemporary ones. So obviously the ALP got elected in 2022, and one of their key things, Mark Dreyfus here, is done a lot of work to legislate through a new independent national anti-corruption commission. So they believe that they have a mandate to do this. I expect this one to largely not be opposed by the opposition, and therefore it should sail through the Parliament, because the former Morrison government did, in theory, have some kind of anti-corruption commission on their policy agenda as well. It's just that they never got round to it. So I expect that one to be respected, but we'll have to wait and see. Now, this one's only come up just this week. Anthony Albanese is claiming a mandate for multi-employer collective bargaining, because he said prior to the election that he needed to increase wages, and he gave a speech at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry that we need to increase people's wages, but many people are pushing back on that idea, saying, well, you didn't mention multi-employer bargaining as a way of getting there, but the government are arguing that that was good enough for it to count for a government mandate. I suspect that this won't be as easily respected, but I guess it'll all come down to the view of the crossbench on this policy. And more generally speaking, Labor did win the election, but they had a very low primary vote, historically low primary vote for a winning government. So as soon as the election was over, the opposition were already claiming that they have a very weak mandate to implement their legislative agenda because of that low primary vote, that the voters didn't really endorse them. It was more a punishing of the outgoing government, not an endorsement of the incoming one. So you probably see that not a lot of Anthony Albanese's mandate will be respected by the non-government forces in the current parliament. So in conclusion, I would say that mandates are frequently evoked by parties trying to negotiate their policies through the parliament, but only rarely is it respected with little debate or amendment. More often, the crossbench use their power or use their balanced power mandate to force amendments to the policy or to agree to unrelated measures that align with the crossbench policy objective. So governments have a much harder time convincing Parliament they have a mandate if non-government parties see a political advantage to opposing it. It was not seen as a highly visible policy prior to the last election, and the governing party did not win convincingly. So hopefully that gives you plenty to talk about in any potential question on mandates. All the best, guys, with your preparations for the exam.